All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming on today. This is our third virtual seminar for the year, and I'm really pleased with this one because it's got a good colleague of mine speaking, so I'm really excited about this. Someone's chatting there at the moment, so if you could just keep quiet for a tick. So our next session will be a joint webinar with the Australian Association of Gerontology. And so they'll be using different technology that'll be based on your webcams in your offices at home or wherever. But that one will feature Sean Koo, who's a lecturer in research education and development, and we'll be talking about building your career through getting your research out to a broader audience. So that'll be bringing our guys and the AAG guys together, which we like to do at least once a year. And that'll be on Wednesday the 8th of October at 12 noon Australian Eastern Standard Time. So we'll send more details out when we get closer to the date, including how to link into that one, because it won't be through the VC rooms. Before we kick off, I've got a little bit of administration to go through. The organisation for the ERA conference in Adelaide in November is going in leaps and bounds. They're doing an incredible job. They've lined up a massive amount of sponsorship, so I reckon I can go on holidays for about 3 weeks afterwards, which will be great. The call for abstracts has just closed last Friday, and we've had a really good roll-up of abstracts covering a diverse range of topics. So it's going to be a really good conference. If you were intending to submit an abstract and it fell off your list, you can have till the weekend if you're really, really keen to put one in, because I'm organising the abstracts review as we speak, so I'm sure I can fit another couple more in. So if you haven't put one in and you'd love to get it in, then do so by Sunday, and we'll squeeze you in. But if not, regardless, come along. It's going to be a great conference. As usual, it's the 2 days prior to the AAG conference, so the Monday, Tuesday. And we've already got a great keynote speaker, Karen Anstey from ANU, lined up. And our workshops are on publishing and longitudinal methods, so 2 great workshops. So go to the website, www.era.edu.au, and check it out. We'll be around announcing the 2014 round for the ERA Travel Exchange shortly, and if you don't remember, that provides funding for up to $10,000 for an extended international 6-week exchange with a university, or less than that for a similar sized local exchange. So check that out once it comes through. It's a really great opportunity. A couple of people get funded each year to do some really interesting work. We'll be releasing that information in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. So, to the session today, we've got 30 people registered across about 13 nodes. We've got a couple we haven't got yet, but hopefully they'll come on soon. What I'll do is I'll go through each node and just get you to say your names, so that for those that we can see, if you ask a sensible question, then people know who to talk to later on to say, I want to chat to Sonia at Gippsland. I always point to Sonia at this point. She asks all the sensible questions.
Oh, no.
So, Nico in ACU. Can you hear us? It may be you've got your microphone muted at your end, mate, because I know you can hear us, so if there's a button there for you to press for us to hear you. I'll let you keep working at that. Auckland, it's really great to have Auckland on. We've been booking this room for a couple of years now, but we haven't had any luck. Really great to have you. If you want to say your names, that'd be wonderful.
Balakrishnan Sukumara Nair, Bala Nair.
Wonderful, thank you. There's I think another couple of people who are supposed to turn up there, but as you walk out, say thank you to Graham Chitty, because he sent the flyer around your department, which was really, really helpful. I'm just responding to an email here to Pam saying that there's something going wrong with Aubrey Wodonga. Now someone's just speaking. Who's that?
Hi, Pam.
Oh, is that VU?
Hello.
It is. G'day, VU.
Yes, hello.
Welcome. All right, we're going down the list. We've got Federation University, so myself, Matthew Carroll, and
Sonia Allen.
Sonia Allen. Latrobe, Albury, Wodonga, we've got a bit of an issue happening, so hopefully they can come on soon. They're emailing me saying they're there and ready, but there's a connection flaw happening. Marita in Bendigo.
Hi, Marita Chisholm.
Thank you. Now, we don't have anybody at Monash Clayton at the moment. The person that's due there, Sue, is having car problems. And Parkville we don't have yet. Monash, Malaysia, Saris.
Thank you.
G'day, Saris. Really great to have you on the team.
Thank you very much.
Do we have University of Adelaide?
So will I get them to come over
Okay,
here?
I can see the room, so maybe there's no one there.
Hello, Pam, it's Chris from Wodonga again. All our people are over in a different room, but I've found where they are. But we're not getting any audio in this room. I'm just wondering whether I should reconnect and you try again.
We can hear Wodonga on the phone, so it's working from this end.
Reboot.
Okay. All right. Pharmacy, I can see you've just joined. Hi, Pharmacy.
Yeah.
It's usually a bit of a challenge, but it's a bit more of a challenge this year. Moss Room, HMRI.
Yeah, look, don't worry, because it's only me here. I thought there were going to be a few people here. So,
Well, I'll try this one again.
Moss Room, can you hear us?
I'll try and get a copy of this lecture from
Yeah. All right. I'll try this
people.
again. Yep. Okay. All right. Bye.
Okay. If we can't hear you in the Moss Room, so you may be muted, there's probably a remote control that you need to press a button on.
Press something or do something.
We can. So that was VU, was it?
Yeah, it's Celine and Judy and...
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. We've got Peter and Utah sitting patiently waiting for us to start.
Oh, well, if you have to get them out here anyway to do something. Okay. Yep. Yeah, I'll just go to the loo in the meantime. Barbary Clark. Oh, yeah, Barbary Clark. A-R-Y.
So, I'm waiting for Barbara to get off the phone so I can ask her what's the problem.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Barbary, can you hear us at Parkville? Okay, there seems to be a Parkville going one way but not the other at the moment, but we'll get there. And VU, I saw you come on. Hi there. All right, so.
Yeah, sorry.
You're right. Welcome. So sorry about the technical glitches. It's amazing. We think we're all lined up, but things happen, so I'm not quite sure how. Same usual ground rules as always. Please keep the noise down, and if you can mute your nodes while Peter's speaking, that would be great, because that way you can make comments to the side about how wonderful he is without us hearing it. If you've got mobile phones like that, turn them down to silent. If you want to ask a burning question in the middle of the presentation, then do so. But if it's a general question, wait till the end, and we'll ask it as part of the actual general discussion. And we are recording this session as normal. We don't actually have the normal AV recorder. We've only got an audio recorder for this one because the other one's broken. But be aware that you are being recorded and it will be loaded up on the web. So don't say anything too silly. But I'm particularly pleased about today's session. As I said earlier, it involves a good colleague of mine, Peter Orpin, talking about a project that I'm actually involved in. So I'll actually find out what it is we've been doing, which is really helpful. Peter's a senior research fellow with the University Department of Rural Health and the Rural Clinical School at the University of Tasmania, and has a long-standing research interest in communities, particularly in rural communities, and how both communities and individuals deal with change. And his interests have come together in the project he's talking about today, which has been supported by both ARC and NHMRC grants. So he'll be talking about the development of a tool to support evidence-informed policy and practice, development in a rural ageing well setting. But the project's actually morphed into a more generic tool that anyone, whether they're in their ageing field or not, can actually use to support the pull of evidence into practice. So we're really pleased to have Peter here today, and looking forward to a good discussion afterwards. All right, Peter, off you go. And just say new slide and I'll press the button for you.
Okay,
Thanks everybody, good afternoon. I always wanted to travel and this is the way to do it from the armchair. You might find this presentation a little bit out of left field because we do that field. I'm afraid whether we want to or not. As Matthew said, we never know where the project's going to go. But I'm not going to present today on the full project. I'm just going to float one of the we've been playing with in this project that underlies the guide or the tool that we've produced. I need to acknowledge, Matthew, how long do these slides take in terms of delay? They instantaneous?
It takes about.
They're instant.
I just missed the next slide, so that was my fault.
I really need to start off with saying this is a National Health and Medical Research Council partnership grant between Monash and UNITAS and some Tasmanian government industry partners. The list's up there. Judy Walker, Professor of Rural Health at Monash, is the lead researcher. I'm second one, and I'm sort of driving the research arm of it, doing the day-to-day stuff. I need to, next slide, thanks. I need to start to tell you, by telling you a little bit about the project we set out on, because where we've ended up, there's almost no visible relationship to where we said we're going to go. Sad about that, but I think in research you have to follow your nose somewhat. As you learn along the way, you find that you were probably fairly naive when you started the journey. So we set out to develop a tool to support policy and practice developers. So we focused on practitioners, people who are doing policy or people who are doing programs. We wanted to increase the evidence base for rural ageing well policies and practices. We've had a long-standing interest in rural ageing, and we naively thought that we'd just pop together a set of learned wisdoms that policymakers could refer to when they started to do policies. And that sounded like a simple project. It's evolved in ways we never envisaged. What we really have come to understand is that this original idea was somewhat naive, that at some sort of pre-packaged body of evidence that we could just pop out there and people would dive into was not going to work. For a start, there's not a lot of good evidence around ageing well interventions at all, let alone rural ageing well interventions. I mean, there's a lot of bits and pieces, but nothing coherent. There's a lot of evidence out there about lifestyle interventions that are actually applicable to ageing well. Ageing well is not that different to living well at any age, as we know. The same things matter. Socioeconomic status, adaptation to change, housing, security, income, all of those things. They're all the same. So there's a lot of evidence out there, but it's nowhere where you can get a handle on it and say this is the body of evidence for ageing well. So to track all that down was almost impossible, and to coalesce it into a neat little package. There's a lot of issues that I want to come to, and this is the nub of what we're doing here, about the nature of evidence in policy and practice, and how that evidence has to really be relevant to the context in which it's being used. So if you just have a pre-packaged body of evidence, there's problems around how it goes out of date, there's problems around translating it to practice, there's problems around how you incorporate it into practice, and there are problems around the fact that evidence is growing like topsy all the time, and it spreads out all over. So it's very hard to pull together. And the second issue was, and the one that we'll concentrate on quite a bit here, is the problem of translating the sorts of evidence we as academics think we've produced into policy practice. And that's a lot less slippery than we think it is. So, cut a long story short, we decided that there's not much point in trying to put this pre-packaged evidence for rural ageing well, and rather what we had to do was to work with policymakers and practice developers to help them to understand what evidence they needed and help them gather that evidence. So what we're saying is it has to be driven from there rather than us from top down, and I'll talk a bit about that. Next slide, please. I wanted Matthew, next slide.
Yeah, I already have. Is it the co-creation slide, Peter?
Sorry, Terry. Short side, it's getting old. I don't know what title you got for this talk when it went out, because it changed, it evolved. But the idea of co-creation, sometimes we call it co-generation. We're moving in our ideas about evidence and practice and evidence and policy, and researchers are now beginning to realise that you can't just produce the evidence and then give it to the policy of people. And we're starting to move to the idea if we want decent evidence, particularly in the social sciences, we've got to work together to create it. Co-generation, co-creation, research partnerships, whatever you like to call it. But we need to think very carefully about what we mean by co-creation. And I've had some conversations recently that suggest to me that there are some of the leading researchers in this area haven't quite got their head around what co-creation might mean. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's about a fully equal partnership, and that's a very hard thing for us as researchers to get our head around, because we tend to think that the knowledge and expertise resides in the academics, and that we just hand it on to the mechanics doing the policy stuff, and they will use it. We have to recognise that it's got to be an equal partnership, that we both bring things to this that the other does not. I think we first have to acknowledge that researchers and policymakers and practitioners all share the same goal. I'm a social scientist, and I've never met a social scientist who didn't want to change the world. And that's what we're all about, really, is about finding ways to make the world a better place. And that's our common goal. And we need to keep reminding ourselves that bureaucrats are a lot of very sincere and talented people who are engaged in exactly that same process, trying to change the world for the better. We hold essentially different bodies of knowledge, but they're equal and equally important. And we each need what the other brings to the table. Policymakers have a large body of knowledge and understanding and expertise, and we need to acknowledge that that's equally important to our academic and research basis. It's so easy to think that because we've studied these things in depth, we've got a mortgage on the knowledge or on the expertise. We have to move beyond this dichotomy that we researchers are the producers of evidence and they, the practitioners and policymakers, are the consumers of evidence. We have to co-produce and co-consume, and that's the theme of what I'm talking about. This is where I want to take you to in the end. If we're going to have decent evidence-based social policy and practice, we've got to co-produce, co-generate, and not us generate, then use, and do it together. Academic research can't provide all the answers to policy. It never does. It won't even be sometimes the most important influence in policies. And we'll talk a bit about that. It's just part of the mix. That the social science evidence we produce can never be translated into practice in anything more than what Portson calls a level of mid-level theory, and what I prefer to call rather sort of banally generalised understandings. It's not like insulin and blood sugar levels. You don't give an exact dose and you get an exact response. And so you don't bring a social science piece of evidence into a new situation and expect to get exactly the result you got in the previous one. And the third thing, and this is one that's probably a bit outside the square and a bit left field, is I want to make the argument that we're both working essentially with the same conceptual model, and that would be really important. It's really important for us to understand that model and to share that model, because that allows us to work together. Next slide, next. A quick course tour through current thinking of evidence and policy. Some people are still talking about evidence-based policy. That has long been abandoned, the idea that policy would be evidence-based. It's not the way policy is either done or should be done. There are too many other factors that come into policy for there to just be this beautiful scientific model of, well, we have the evidence, we put the evidence into play and we get the result. The field is far too complicated for that. There are values and beliefs and political pressures and resource pressures and issues of agendas that are all playing out here, and the policymakers have to juggle those. You can't just scrub them out. The policy process, Lindgren very unfortunately called it modelling through. This was 1959, I think he did this work, and I don't think it's been superseded. But by modelling through in policy, he didn't mean that it was just chaos. What he meant was that people do things, they see if they work, if they don't work, they modify them a bit and then they see if they work, and they gradually and incrementally improve policy process. That's the way policy works. All the time juggling with, and I like this sort of five, values, interests, personalities, timing, circumstance and happenstance. We don't have any of those in the universities. I mean, as researchers, we don't have to worry about values and interests and personalities and timing, but they do. And I like happenstance. It's an old-fashioned word, but a lot of policy and practice is about making use of the time windows you have that just happen to appear. Policy process and the practice process isn't an event, it's a process, it's a dialogue, a struggle over ideas and values. And what we seek to do with our evidence is not take that over, but to inform that process, allow people to better quality information. There's a limited space in the policy and bureaucratic environment for what I'm calling slow thinking. I don't have time today to go into this in any great detail, but you will find the references to Kahneman's work on slow and fast thinking. It's number 7. What Kahneman argued is that the model we use in scientific research, where we carefully consider things, weigh all the evidence critically, critical analytical thinking, and make decisions based on that, is not the norm in life. It's not the norm in bureaucracies, it's not the norm in our own life, and never was. When the saber-toothed tiger appeared at the cave entrance, we did not sit down to calculate his trajectory and whether or not he'd be dangerous and which is the better way. We ran like hell. And we lived most of our lives, Kahneman argues, and with good evidence, this way. We actually react with inbuilt or pre-packaged mental models. We don't gather the evidence carefully. The only time we gather the evidence carefully is when the mental models don't work and we get eaten or hurt or whatever. Then we sit back and say, well, actually that mental model needs a bit more evidence. Now our role as academics is actually to spend our lives in what Kahneman calls slow thinking, which is actually sit back and consider all the factors and weigh all the evidence. The problem for evidence-based practice is we have to help practitioners to move from fast thinking to slow thinking. They're in the jungle. They've got pressures from all sides to them to make decisions, to act, and to get it right. And they don't have time for this slow, critical thinking that we engage in. And that's where we've got our contribution to make. And our tool is about actually helping practitioners to slow up a bit and say, let's weigh some things. And we have to appreciate how hard this is in the policy environment. You know, to say, no, sorry, I know the Minister wants it on his desk in the morning, but I need at least 2 weeks to read the papers. It just doesn't work. So we have to give them models to help them think through that. So what the aim now is evidence-informed rather than evidence-based practice. That is, the evidence is informing that process, that dialogue, that discussion, and that's a role for us as researchers. Policymakers and practitioners will use evidence when it helps them do their job. You know, we mustn't think they're anti-scientific or anti-evidence. If they think it will help them do their job, and Lomax has done a nice, elegant study on this, that they will seek out evidence when they see the need. Our own work in this project, where we're looking at ageing well policies and practice, shows us that they are very good, the policymakers are very good at seeking out evidence where they need it, because they are a very good grasp of evidence around things like population ageing and around the parameters for healthy or ageing well. But it also makes life difficult for them, because not everybody wants the evidence, and the evidence doesn't always fit with the other factors people are dealing with. There's been a lot of work from us as academics to understand how we can translate. There's even an NHMRC evidence translation faculty. If you read this material, it's all about researchers trying to understand policy people so they can push their evidence into the process. It's this sort of top-down idea of, we need to understand policymakers so we can get in there and convince them to use our evidence. If you want an example of that, a colleague of mine has died in the last week or so, but she wrote a book in 2010, and that's a very good example, very good survey of the field of academics trying to understand policymakers. Almost nobody, and this is where we've come in, almost nobody has actually said, what is it that prompts policymakers to actually look for evidence? Instead of us having to push evidence in, how do we get policymakers saying, please give me the evidence, I want evidence? And when you look at that, the reason is because to identify the need for evidence, you need to identify the questions you need to answer, and to identify the questions you need to answer, you need to be undertaking in-depth, critical, reflective thinking. Coming back to Kahneman's slow thinking, critical, reflective thinking raises questions. It tells you what you don't know and what you need to understand, and that sends you in search of the evidence. That's when the policymakers are going to go to the academic evidence producer, and say, please give me the evidence because I have this question I need to answer. And our whole guide is about trying to tap into why this critical thinking doesn't have a bigger place in policy, and how we can help policymakers slow down and think, what is it that we need? I missed a slide move, I think, there, Matthew. Could I have the next slide? I've been speaking to slide facilitating evidence update. Yeah. So this is all about how can we facilitate a critical, reflective approach to evidence in policy and practice. And I'll get to. First, we have to have a bit of think about what the nature of evidence is in social issues. And you were ahead of me there, Matthew, thanks. It's very hard for those of us who work in a health faculty or in a health environment to grasp the different nature of evidence in science as to the evidence in the physical and the biomedical sciences. Social phenomena are basically non-linear systems. technically, that means that small inputs at T0 result in hugely different outputs at T1. In a linear system, you know what you put in at T0, if you get a certain dose of insulin, you'll get a certain reasonably predictable blood sugar at the end of it. Social science doesn't work like that, and we don't need to be posh about how we understand that. Just think about your own life. If your partner gets out of bed the wrong side in the morning, can alter the whole course of your subsequent day. Or if somebody cuts you off in the traffic, can lead to a totally different outcome at the end of the day, because you react differently to things and things play out very differently, and instead of ending up with a nice productive day, you can end up with a total mess. And all social systems are like that. And if you translate it to policy and practice, you can have a model that works perfectly somewhere, and you put it into an almost identical situation, and there is one key person who doesn't support it or supports it or gets it, has a different view, and your outcome will be totally different. And that's when you people say, oh, but it was a good evidence-based model and it hasn't worked at all. Of course it hasn't, because there are so many of these confounding, uncontrolled, uncontrollable and unknowns. You know, Donald Rumsfeld's, there's known knowns and there's known unknowns and there's unknown unknowns when you're dealing with social systems. So and this is a point that we really need to hammer home, that every social intervention is a new experiment. No matter how good your evidence you're using, when you pop it into a new context, it's a social experiment. And that's critical for our learning. Almost all policy in the end, even evidence-based policy, is a suck it and see approach, a learn by doing. It's an incremental evolution of learning by practice. Back to Lindrum's muddling through. Do it, see if it works. And that's how we live our lives most of the time. Back to Kahneman. You know, we have mental models that work fairly well about how to deal with people and situations, what's going to happen when we do this or that. But they don't always work, and when they don't work, if we're sensible people, we change that mental model, but we think, well, actually, you know, I'm misunderstanding. I always use the idea of the mother of the teenage boy who decides not to pick up his washing because he won't pick it up and put it in the laundry for washing. So I'll leave it on the bedroom floor, and when he runs out of clean clothes, then he'll come and start doing it. But of course, any mother of a teenager knows that what happens is that the teenager wears the dirty T-shirt again and again until the mother blows the top and can't bear seeing him with the dirty T-shirt. So, yeah, then we have to look at our mental model of a teenager. But until that happens, we don't. So, look at policy that way. These people are actually suck it in and see, and if it doesn't work, then they gather more evidence. And we need to work with them in that, because we're the people who can produce that evidence. We have the skills. New slide, thanks, Matthew. A little sidestep here. I want to talk about the model that we share. All of us, policymakers, researchers, lay people, work most of the time on a series of little causal effect mental models. Back to, you know, the mother and a teenage, you know, there is a mental model, the causal effect model. You know, why things don't happen. Going back again to the family situation, you know, we have a tension with our partner. We all have a little mental model about what caused it. Most of us know that mental model is usually fairly faulty. Oh, he's not talking to me because I did that. And then when you try and correct that and nothing happens, you begin to think, well, actually, maybe it wasn't that. So we're all working with these little mental models, but we rarely make them explicit. And the whole principle we're working on with our tool here in this is to make those mental models explicit, because only when they're explicit can you actually test them? What do I mean by mental models? Next slide, thanks. Matthew. All of us as researchers are working with causal effect model hypotheses. Even if you're doing so-called exploratory research or using grounded theory where you're letting it emerge, I always argue that at the back of your mind you have a hypothetical mental model. You have to, because how do you design your research? You know, if you haven't some idea of what's causing what that you want to test, you don't know what questions to ask, you don't know what things to measure. So we all have this little mental model, and we don't always put it down, but it's, you know, factor or factors X contribute to or are causing some undesirable or not fully desirable situation Y. You know, some of the things we deal with in age research, you know, ageism. We all have these little mental models, and I'm seeing all this dialogue at the moment around mature age unemployment and the raising of the pension age. The fact that ageism contributes to bringing about or causing older age unemployment. It's a standard mental model about ageism. Aging, it causes older age, it contributes to. And those of you who are into social modelling will know that social modellers can quite cleverly use large-scale data sets to say that, you know, 16% of the ageism measure the ageism measure will explain 16% of the effect in older age unemployment. So we use these models quite formally. You know, lack of exercise, if we come more to the biomedical, lack of exercise causes higher incidence of falling. We work with these models all the time. What we don't acknowledge is that everybody else is working with it. Policymakers are too. Next slide, thank you, Matthew. Policymakers, whether this is animated, let's hope it animates. Policymakers are working with that sort of model as well, because they want to change the world as well. They want to make things better. So they want to understand what's causing the world as it is, or what might cause the world to be less than ideal. You know, that more older people are in jobs, or that older people have fewer falls, or that the ageing population doesn't bankrupt our health system. So they want to understand what the causal factors are so that they can stick their oar in and change them. So, next slide, next press. Matthew, see if this works, see if the then works. Yep. That's right, and again. So, the policymakers work with the same model as we do. If factor X is causing the state we want to fix, then we'll put in a policy or practice to address factor X, and we'll bring about what we want. I mean, sorry if this sounds banal, but actually, so rarely we actually map these things out as models, because until you actually do that, there are all sorts of inbuilt assumptions in these models that we need to test and don't test. So we're both thinking the same way, we're both working on the same mental model. They want to fix it, we want to fix it. We tell them what the causes are, or the contributing factors are. They seek to take that to actually affect change. Next slide, please, Matthew. What happens? In a theoretically perfect world, in an evidence-based model world, perfect evidence-based model world, we as researchers would tell them very clearly what it is that's causing this, and they would take that evidence and they would put an appropriate policy or practice in place, and the world would be wonderful and fixed. Anyone who works in policy or speaks to anyone works in policy, the outcomes are more like I've got in this slide. You have the problem, you put in place your intervention. What do you get? You get some of the things you plan to change working for some of the people some of the time, but mostly you get unexpected and unintended consequences. You get changes that you didn't expect. Sometimes those changes, and surprisingly often, those changes actually fix the problem in ways we didn't actually understand or expect. And there's some good work by Bacci on the fact that we shouldn't talk about social problems, we should talk about social resolutions, because there are always multiple ways to get to the resolution of a social problem. Once we define the problem, we define the solution. Rather, we should be defining what the resolution would look like, and that leaves open a lot of different pathways to that resolution. So, basically what I'm saying is mostly the model doesn't work. And it's again our mental models we use. Quite often they don't work. And being human beings, what we tend to do is we tend to do them again and only try harder and expect them to work. Whereas a critical evaluative approach would be to say, well, if it didn't work in the way we expected, then there are some things about my model that I need to revisit. And this is the whole point of where I want to come today. It's the whole point of critical thinking in policy, and it's the whole point of the work we do, is testing these models. And we can't test them until we've made them explicit. Next slide, thank you, Matthew. I'm going to talk a bit about program evaluation. It's a frustrating area for anyone who's into critical thinking, because it's full of so much potential. You know, never has there been so much potential so unrealised in so many instances. I don't know how many of you read evaluations, but hardly ever do evaluations tell you anything you really want to know. Partially because they're really not going to say the things they need to say. They say, oh, this didn't work out as well as it, and maybe it was that or that, where they knew very well it was because somebody refused to cooperate or undermined it, or there was a total miscalculation of what resources were needed, whatever. But the most frustrating thing about most evaluations is they're done post facto audits. They're done after the end of programs, and they ask the simple question, did the program work? Did it produce the outputs? Did it produce the outcomes? Did we meet our goals? Apart from anything else, that's a pretty appalling thing to get to the end of a 3-year program and then ask whether it worked or not. There's 3 years of everybody's life and a lot of resources down the drain if you didn't. Pawson's work, and I advise you to acquaint yourself with Pawson's stuff, because if you're interested in social science and social science evidence, Orpin points out that few if any programs work for everybody for all people in all circumstances at all times. And conversely, few programs fail for all people in all places at all times. Most programs work in some ways for some people at some times. And that's perfectly in line with the complexity of human life. Policies, social interventions are complex systems inserted into already complex systems. Huge number of variables, most of them uncontrollable, many of them unmeasurable. So you can never be sure and never expect a program or a model to work perfectly for everybody at every time. What Pawson points out is the question we want to answer is not what is the best program for this, but rather which programs work for which people in which circumstances, and how can we make that program work for more people at more times in more circumstances. What do we need to tweak here? What diversity do we need within a program to take care of the diversity? we need to, when programs don't work as we expect all the time, it suggests that the model on which we've built our program is at best incomplete. It's normally not wrong. It's the same as a program rarely fails. What it is that generally the program, our understanding is incomplete and has gaps in it, or is not sufficiently nuanced, not sufficiently sophisticated to understand all the variations we're going to come across. So what we need to do as researchers and policymakers is actually to begin to nuance those programs, begin to ask those questions. And this is where I want to come to, and what we're trying to do is say, when you have your model that is the best guide to the questions you need to ask, where you need to gather more evidence, where you need to produce more evidence. Policies and programs in action represent to us as researchers the richest field for understanding the things we want to understand. Because this is the world in action. This is our ideas in practice. This is our models in test. And it's heartbreaking to see the programs where the evaluation is fielded out virtually to accountants to count the numbers, and all the learnings, the rich learnings, disappear. They are in the heads of the people who are running the program. They don't get disseminated because these people are actually cut out of our world of journals and academic discourse. And we as academics don't deign to enter that polluted territory, because evaluation deals with such an impure, uncontrolled world, and therefore it doesn't produce any nice, valid evidence. So that huge opportunity is left. And if I have a mission left in the years I've got left, is that message to policymakers. Evaluation is critical, continuous from the beginning. Evaluation is critical, and in our guide we're actually saying you use the model to design your program, because that causal model is what underlies your design, and then you can use that same model to refine your understanding and your evidence from your model. Next stage, thanks. I think I've already spoken about that, but evaluation is a research opportunity to test the real-world operation of our theoretical models. This is where the rubber hits the road, and we understand whether we're just gazing at our neighbours in nice, sanitised conditions with tight methodologies and carefully chosen samples, and this is where the rubber hits the road. Does it hold up when it gets out there in the real world? The model's the key to this. We have causal models. Policymakers and programmers are becoming increasingly familiar with those models in the guise of program logic. I don't know how many of you are aware of program logic models, and I'll introduce you to them. The interesting thing about program logic models is that while they're causal models, they actually leave the causal bit of the model out. You have a look sometime at a program logic model for program evaluations, and you'll find that it starts at the point of the intervention, and the cause is somewhere there off outside the horizon at the beginning, where the cause, our understanding of the cause, is absolutely essential to our understanding of what is an appropriate intervention, because that doesn't make any sense unless it's predicated. You know, we intervene to stop falls by teaching people Tai Chi, so we evaluate a Tai Chi program, and we don't really evaluate the causal model is, which the causal model is, we think, actually the lack of certain exercises and coordinations that contribute to people's lack of balance and contribute to falling. No point evaluating that program unless we're evaluating that bit of it as well, that underlying seminal causal. Next slide, please, Matthew. This is to just take a minute to run you through this. This is what happens when you take the model, the causal or program logic model from the evaluation literature, which generally starts about the middle of this, after now that's got the numbers on it. So after that, the arrow near point 3, the number 3 there. Most program logic models start there. They start with an intervention, they measure output, outcomes, impacts, and whether there's a resolution. They look at the activities that are done, they look at the resources or inputs. Our causal models that we work with go across that. We say, what is the factor that's contributing to that state? That factor's factor X, we think it causes that state, and if you want to fix it, then you've got to intervene. If you want to fix mature age unemployment, one of the causal factors is ageism, therefore the policymakers need to do something about ageism. That's the model. So you get the model, let's say, ageism is seen as causing mature age unemployment, taking your way through this model. Therefore, we're going to put some resources in. We're going to have that resources are going to be newspaper, going to be media ads, it's going to be a public health campaign, to have some activities where we educate people about ageism, and that will produce some ageism discussions and educational activities, and the outcomes will be people will change their ageist attitudes and will start to affect the problem of mature age unemployment. Most of us would say that they can pour an awful lot of money and activities into trying educating people about ageism, and they will produce fairly marginal, measurable outcomes in terms of reduced unemployment for older people. They'll produce some outcomes, and we can model this as social models and say this campaign produced a 4% increase in mature age unemployment or whatever. It will do a lot of other things when we do. If we put a lot of effort into a publicity campaign about ageism, we'll get a whole lot of other outcomes. We may even get negative outcomes. As a social researcher, I can posit that such campaigns could well bring in resentment against older people. You know, they're blowing their trumpet, they're pushing their case all the time. They're accusing me of being ageist. I'm not ageist. I'm not an ageist person. I'm not a racist person. Outcomes might be, I'm going to steer away from this area. It's becoming a bit hot. Let's just quietly employ someone younger. We don't have to deal with all this stuff. What I want to say here is that having this model out here, if we actually model that as researchers and practitioners together, we can say, now let's look at this model. Well, let's put something in place. You're going to put something in place. You're going to put in a publicity campaign about ageism. That makes sense from our causal model. Our causal model says that is a contributing factor, that there is ageism in the workplace, and that makes people more reluctant. Let's put in some sort of initiative. Now, what happens in the real world is the government will then, yes, that's a good idea, we'll put in an initiative. They will run a program, they will hire some accountancy firm to measure the outputs and the incomes, and they'll say, oh, this failed or this worked, but I produced minimal change. What I'm suggesting is policymakers and researchers get together and say critically, let's put this model in place, let's have a look. And I want to finish by looking at these numbers quickly. these are points at which our model is open and I did try and spread these out, so you might need, if you've got a PDF, keep the model in front of you. Factor 1. How robust is our understanding? If you look at that beginning of that model, how robust is our understanding, how nuanced of the causal factors? If things aren't going as we expected, it means we've got to go back and get more evidence about how ageism affects mature age unemployment. What else affects us? Point 2, how well do we understand the present problem of mature age unemployment? What are its dimensions? Who's involved? What sort of people are involved? Who does it affect? How does it affect policymakers? Point 3, is the intervention we're putting in appropriately matched to the problem? Does it really? And you say, of course it does, but you'd be surprised how often when you look at interventions and you actually think, actually that is not going to impact that causal model at all. But somebody thought it was a good idea. And very often interventions will come from good ideas. It's at the intervention point that the biggest pressure comes on people to act without the evidence. Because that's when the governments say, if you look at government briefings, they're worried about 2 things. 1, that they seem to act and do something about it. And 2 is what they do doesn't come back and bite them on the bottom. Risk management. That's the 2 concerns. So there is always that point at that point. Let's just do something about this. Just who's got a good idea? Who knows something that works somewhere? And there isn't time to sort of weigh everything up. But that's a point we need to be looking at together. We need to be looking at point 4 there, which is the resources and inputs. What are you putting in the right things? Is there enough of them? How often? The model's fine, but it falls down because we haven't had the appropriate skills that goes into it. Or the people who do it aren't putting it into the right place. And the activities appropriate. Point 5. I'm having to whiz through these myself. We're up to point 6. Matthew, you're still with me? Point 6, the outputs of the model. Have we identified the outputs? How often, do we actually not know what the outputs will be because we don't quite understand the process we're dealing with? We have assumptions. Every one of these models is absolutely replete with taken for granted assumptions. Those of you who have got PhDs, try modelling and trying to understand the assumptions in your model that you actually are not questioning in your research. The things that your model is actually dependent on, but you're not actually questioning, because sometimes they might come back to bite you. Do we know what extent our planned actions are producing the outputs? Is it working the way we wanted it to in terms of outcomes and impacts? That's 6, 7 and 8. If it's not, then the instinct is to go immediately to the proximal bit, to the activities or to the resources. Very rarely in policy is there the capacity to go back and examine your model further back in terms of your understanding of the causal factors or understanding of the way the causal factors interact with the things you're doing in terms of the intervention. Problematic state of the world, number 10 on that model. Going back to Barchi's work, how often we haven't actually thought about what the world would look like if what we're trying to accomplish was we actually managed to accomplish what we wanted to do. If any of you ever worked with evaluations, you asked to come and do evaluation, you actually ask people, well, what do you think the world will look like if what you're doing works? And you'll get a whole lot of different answers. And quite often people say, oh, well, the problem will be fixed. The problem won't be a problem anymore. So what does the world look like if the problem's not a problem anymore? What's the world look like if mature age unemployment is a problem? Isn't a problem anymore? Is it when it's 2%? Where is it when everybody who wants a job's got one, regardless of their capacity? I don't know. But unless you're questioning those critically and analytically, then your whole model's falling. And the last one, which gets lost every time, is the context. The world does not stand still. It never has done, it never will. So the perfect world you modelled when you collected your data no longer exists. And the world you modelled when you put your intervention into place probably no longer exists. And it may be that your model, that all your thinking was perfectly rational, you had the right cause, you put the right intervention in place, you had the resources you needed, you conducted the activities. It didn't work because the world's moved on. Or maybe it did work because the world's moved on. And I think, just closing, I think the biggest example of that is probably going to be mature age unemployment. Right? Just using that as an example. It may well be, while we're all dithering around trying to understand the causes for it, the labour market, the younger people in the labour market will drop off to the point where employers have got no choice but to start looking at older workers, and all the ageism will disappear immediately when there's no young people to choose from. I've run out of time, as I always do. That's just what I wanted to break with. The idea that if we can actually, two things really, we need to co-produce with policy people. We don't need to just involve them when we're finished or have them on our reference groups. We need to work with them and understand their problem as well as ours. And we could well start using these sorts of models as a tool to work with policy people, because they'll understand it and you'll understand it. So that's all I want to say. Thanks very much. I haven't left much time for questions.
I almost just cancelled the call. I pressed the wrong button. I can see, is that a hand up there in pharmacy?
Let me know.
Was that a hand in pharmacy I saw there? Barbary?
Yes.
Go for it.
Yes, it's more of a comment than a question. I really resonated to what you said about people not wanting the evidence. I'm researching women's health and more specifically lesbian health, and the federally funded longitudinal study on women's health, a prospective study on 42,000 women, refuses to ask a question on sexual orientation so that we cannot collect the evidence. And my view is that they refuse to ask that question because if they did, they would have policymakers and practitioners would have to do something with the answer.
Yeah, you may or may not be right. To me, I get this a lot actually, a reaction a lot. I think as a critical thinker, what you deserve to do is test the model you just gave me. You said, I think it's because. I would suggest to you that you need to map that model and actually gather yourself some evidence to test it, because you may or may not be right. I suspect you're a bit right and only a bit right. No, I don't have a position on that, but what I'm saying is that they have their reasons, you have a mental model about what their reasons are, and to me the critical thinking is to actually sit down with these people and construct your mental model and test it and ask them to construct their mental of why they don't do it. Because it's only because you've got a set of assumptions built in, they've got a set of assumptions built to their position, you've got a set of drivers, they've got a set of drivers, and at the moment you're butting heads. But rather than actually saying, well, what are your drivers? What are my drivers? What's my idea of what's going on? What's your idea of what's going on? And that's the way action research works, doesn't it?
Can I make another comment?
Yep.
Yeah.
I've asked them 3 times why they don't ask that question. The first and second times, they said that they couldn't ask a question which would offend people so much that they would leave the cohort forever, and that anyway, sexual orientation had nothing to do with health. So then after that, the second answer, I provided them with evidence from a Senate Standing Committee which considered that sexual orientation is a social determinant of health, and they came back to me with, we only ask policy relevant questions.
Yeah, I'm not judging their reasons one way or another, you know. But what I'm saying is, I guess the point I'm making that everybody, and policymakers and researchers, have what to them are rational reasons for making decisions. And we think our rational reasons are rational and are well based. Otherwise we wouldn't hold them unless we're stupid. But most of us aren't stupid. Although most of us will think those that differ from us would appear to be stupid because they don't have the same models as we do. All I'm saying is that I don't know if it can resolve it. I don't know what else is going on there, and there probably is. But all I'm saying, if you take a critical, rational approach to it, is that what's happening is not working, certainly for you, and somewhere in there lies the reason. Whether it's a stated reason or not, I don't know. But that's what I'm trying to say, that I'm spooking critical, rational thinking up front on these things, because our first impetus is always to take an only position and not a rational decision, and that's perfectly normal and acceptable and makes good sense for survival, and we need to move beyond that, I guess. And I get worried about the fact that most debate, even at policy level, is people yelling at each other, not people sitting down together to try and unpack their models. Sorry, go on.
Well, it certainly gets to the point you raised right at the beginning, Peter, that it's not a simple process of trying to push evidence towards policymakers, or in this case towards people who are setting a research agenda. You've got to have a really good understanding of what their requirements and directions and assumptions are. The world is a messier place than we would like it to be in the ivory tower. Well, not exactly ivory towers here in Gippsland, but ivory 2-level buildings. It is a complicated world, and I've certainly seen those discussions many times before, Barbara, about what questions you can ask and can't ask. It is a really difficult situation. But I know, Peter, from some of the early workshops we've done with this work, just when you do have the opportunity to start that discussion, and in this case it's obviously been a bit difficult, but when you do have the opportunity to start the discussion, you don't know where the discussion goes. I know one of those workshops in Tasmania where you gave them an area or an issue, and they started working towards a problem state, and the discussion just kept going and going, and people were getting so engaged, coming up with things they hadn't even thought about before they started the talk. So, Marita, did I see you with a question, or were you stretching?
Stretching, sorry.
That puts you on the spot. Right, who's got the next question? Look, I'll kick one up. Just to reinforce the comment that Peter made very early on about the lack of evidence behind a lot of what is actually put out there in terms of policy and programs. Peter's done a really big review of the literature looking at policy documents primarily, and just how little it actually refers to the reasons behind interventions. There's a lot of evidence behind ageing well, behind the population ageing, the bigger picture stuff. But then you see all the stuff that comes out of government documents and program documents where they're talking about where they're going next, where they're talking about particular interventions, and there's generally next to no evidence for why they chose whatever intervention is they've actually set out to do, other than it sounds good and there's available capacity within the region to do it, or it was done somewhere else and it seemed to work. But it's really hard to find the evidence base behind why people went for a particular approach. We know that there's an issue with ageing well, we know the population's getting older, but there's very little support behind why I'm particularly focusing on transport issues, or why I'm focusing on nutrition or this or that. And that's where I think there is a space for a lot of us to get more engaged in the process and provide the evidence to actually help policymakers with some direction. And,
can I make a comment there, Matthew?
You certainly can.
I enjoy you mentioning that there is nothing so powerful as an appealing idea.
Yeah.
And ageing well, if you're studying areas of ageing well, you'll see that it's really solidly based on some nice, warm and fuzzy good ideas. It is quite devoid, or there's very little critical, analytical coming from it. You look at the famous peril or promise that the ageing well debate has gone into these two yelling sides. The peril side, which are identified as the economists, saying, the ageing population is going to push us into fiscal crisis on the health system and the dependency ratio rising to unsustainable levels. So we've got to keep people healthy so that they can pull their weight. We've got to keep them working so they pull their weight. And that has prompted this reactive promise. Patricia Edgar is perhaps, my lead example of that. How dare we say this about our wonderful older people? What a tremendous asset they are, what huge resource they are. There's hardly anyone asking the question in the middle, to what extent can we mobilise this productive capacity and balance it against the fiscal threat? Just in what ways? Is keeping people healthier longer actually going to be cheaper? I would argue that it probably isn't, because what we're going to do is spend a lot of money managing chronic disease, and I'm an example of that allows people to live their lives very fully for a lot longer years, but at a big cost to the system. The whole thing is predicated on increasing the morbidity compression, steepening the final decline so people stay healthy. Hardly anyone's done any really good figures on whether we are actually doing that, rather than just keep flattening the decline, extending and flattening the decline rather than keeping it flat at high function and then people dropping off the twig in nice and quickly and cleanly and cheaply. All of that critical analysis, that's what brought us to this, that critical analysis hasn't been done, because the idea of healthy ageing is so appealing. Whether we've actually managed to make any change with all our policies is a very new question. I've seen no evidence yet to say that healthy ageing, as against all of those social changes that have led to longer and healthier lives, which are not specifically healthy ageing initiatives, but public health initiatives, and if we get all the old people, I don't know, from my point of view, if I've got another 30 years healthy, I'm not sure I want to spend them working. Has grown over show.
Yeah.
So all that critical thinking is missing.
Yeah.
It's just not there.
Well, it's like the active ageing paradigm, this sense that people want to stay active, but does everybody want to be out there and being physically active? There's a really nice paper by Rob Ranjdian from South Australia that talks about the whole concept and says that it doesn't fit every person, doesn't fit every social group, and that you need to be a lot more inclusive and not put expectations on people. or as you say, the productive ageing. I find it a really nasty term myself.
In the same, healthy ageing assumes that you can't age well if you're not healthy.
That's
there are
right.
many people that we come across in their research who are decidedly unhealthy, but are aging very well, are enjoying their life, and they consider they've got really worthwhile lives. And anyway, we need a lot more critical thinking, and it's got to happen not just among researchers, but at the level of policy and practice. And it's very hard to do that when you're in that early.
Yeah. I've certainly been very impressed at the knowledge of the policy makers that I've interacted with, the level of familiarity they have with the research, often more than I do on a particular topic. But you're right, it's the time frames and the expectations that they're in a completely different world, and they're challenging. Yeah. Anyone got
the whole idea of, sorry, I was just going to say, the encouraging thing for researchers is the idea that senior policy makers talk about is the evidence and policy in the drawer. So you have that evidence, you have that policy in your bottom drawer, and they know when they pull it out when the time's right. You know? It might be when you get a change of minister or you get something happening like a big disaster, but if the evidence is not there then you missed the boat.
Yeah.
So
I've certainly heard anecdotal discussions about major ageing research platforms in the UK that were established purely because the minister's advisor happened to have done a gerontology course in his Masters of Public Health and knew a major researcher, and the minister said, "We need an interesting topic. What can you think?" And he said, "Well, I know my old supervisor," and that ended up being a very, very big research platform that was funded for many years, just out of a lucky conversation of being the right person at the right time. So it's a complicated world. All right. Anybody else got any more questions? Any hands to be raised? Wonderful. I'm really looking forward to a question from Auckland.
Hi Peter, I'm Bala, I'm from AUT. So I'm a student doing my PhD here. My question is, how would one measure effectiveness of a health policy through the critical reflective thinking?
Through critical reflective thinking. Sorry, Bala.
Well, I guess I go back to the model. I mean, you say health policy. What are you expecting? The place to start is where you want to finish to measure effectiveness. If you don't have a vision of what the world looks like when the problem's fixed, you're working in the dark. Not focusing on the problem, but trying to understand what it is the world would look like if you fixed it. Because then you know when it's effective. If you have no clear, measurable vision of what the world would look like when the problem was no longer a problem, then you've got no guidance of the pathway to that. And if you just say, what's your problem?
In my research, I'm looking on to the HIV policy of India, and basically I'm looking on to the problems encountered in the counselling, HIV counselling in India, the overload over the counsellors, and there's a stigma and discrimination faced by the high-risk group who are coming to the counsellors for counselling. So the problems surrounding around the counselling, HIV counselling.
So the interesting thing is when you talk about that, you've got a mixture of problem, a causal model, an already formulated causal model, but and no. What would the HIV situation look like in India if what you wanted to fix was fixed? are you saying an India where there was no stigma around HIV, or are you thinking about where education could be freely available and accepted by everyone? I mean, articulate your goal or your result situation.
In this case, there is a multi-stakeholder perspective. The higher funders, they are not. The external funding is diminishing. Government is not putting more money into HIV, and the lower.
There's another vision you've just given me. A vision where it's properly funded.
Yes, it's like a vertical, horizontal problem, like the vertical program or like the top-down approach over the existing health structure.
And complicated.
Yes.
And in a PhD, you've got to identify something quite succinct and clear that you do.
Yes.
And that's really hard when you've got a complicated. You've got a long vision where HIV is properly government funded, there's no stigma, freely available education, all of those things. And each of those is a step towards your eventual goal. HIV is no longer a problem, it's managed. So by modelling out what are the various factors, then you can choose one that you think in that process, a step in that complex thing that you can tackle. I mean, you might only be able to tackle stigma, and you might only be able to tackle stigma among the people who control the funding. Maybe it's easier to tackle stigma there, because tackling it there, you get the funding, even if you haven't tackled it the ground up. Even if the people of the village level, there's still a stigma. If there's not a stigma among the policymakers, then your goal of getting it funded is going to be better, and maybe that will affect. So it's a matter of picking the causal model you want to test. At the moment, you've got 100 interactive. I mean, you can mind map that. You can actually just sit down and mind map, take the problem and map out the causes you think, all the things you think are feeding into that. This is what our guide does, actually, our full guide. Say to people, take that, expand out all the things you can think of that are important here, all of them down on one piece of paper, and then look at each of them and think, now, is that somewhere where I can perhaps do something? Is it somewhere where research would be really important? Is it somewhere where we might be able to bring about change, more effectively bring that? And you can start identifying the causal models that you might want to tackle and find the one that you can put your efforts into. And that's what our tool does, actually says, and then you can actually unpack that little bit and start saying, what are all the factors involved here? Eventually get down to something doable.
Thank you, Peter.
And that question was the perfect evidence as to why that we started with a process where we were focusing on rural ageing well, but where Peter's at now is a far more generic tool, because what's actually involved here goes far beyond what we first predicated in the original grant application. This hopefully has implications for anybody working in the social fields. So, yeah, wonderful. All right, any last questions? Or we're starting to lose nodes, so if there's no more questions, I'll thank Peter.
I've got one comment to make, if I may.
You are? I can't see the top of your hand, so you didn't pop up on the screen. Go for it.
Yeah. I'd like to complicate the HIV picture even further. I don't know if the situation in India is the same in South Africa, but Sizani Ngumbani was telling me of young women there who had access to antiretrovirals, but because they weren't getting food or enough food, and the ARVs, the very brutal on empty stomachs, they were choosing not to take the ARVs even though they had access to them.
It is a complicated world, isn't it? Oh.
But the thing with a complicated world is it's not a reason to despair.
That's
it's
right.
a reason to unpack it and find those bits of the complications you can actually do something useful in.
Okay.
Editorial there.
No, you're ending with a message of hope, Peter. All right, thank you so much, Peter. That was really interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter.
So, as I say, if you haven't done an abstract for the conference and you want to go for the last couple of days, then submit one, and we'll see you at the next seminar, and we'll see you at the conference in November. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.